Hey everyone, I'm back! This feels nervingly ominous. Well, it looks like I'm stuck in my own house until the Yoshis learn the concept of forgiveness, but I can worry about that later. How much later, I don't know, but who cares? It's a new year-ish, which means there's no better time to play video games. Jank games. Any veteran of this channel will remember the cruel, unfortunate, subjective opinion I share, that I hate modern games. There's always something to retro games that I treasure every time I play them. Sure, indie games are more prevalent than ever, and I'll always love those gems, but aside from that, there's not usually much motivation to play most of the other stuff being pumped out today. I'm sure they're good games. Sometimes, but the control behind ambition and quality is very rarely showing up now. However, there was one exception to that rule in regards to retro gaming, when this went to this. Show it in an art museum, that's beautiful. It was an interesting time, new environments were possible, stories could be bigger, controls could be better. Well, at least two of those were actually true. You see, transitioning to the third dimension wasn't as easy as it was nowadays. Developers had to work with new technology, and better yet, how to go about doing it. Some knew they couldn't stick with the same old formula as before. They had to try something new for 3D spaces. Sometimes it worked, but most of the time it actually didn't. Kicking off a legacy of games that continues on to this very day. But I thought it would be fun to look over some of these 2D to 3D games, see how well they made the transition, and whether or not their legacy is even justified. Not all of them, of course, because, come on, I need to get some kind of sunlight here. Nobody else will. I'll only be looking at games that made a proper jump to 3D, not those that basically played like their 2D counterparts, but just with 3D graphics. It'll be fun to see how these games made the jump from 2D to 3D, and who knows, we may see some surprises along the way. Or in this case, lack thereof. Oh, Bubsy, you sorry excuse for a mascot. Even when I try to start a new line of reviews, you always manage to sneak your way into the core of my memory unit. And I hate you for it. Bubsy 3D was actually one of the earliest attempts at transitioning to 3D, releasing the same year as Mario 64 in fact. And what makes Bubsy 3D stand out from Mario? It's a masterpiece. In failure. I want to touch on the graphics first. Now, it's no surprise that a lot of 3D games around this time could struggle with how environments naturally looked. Mario 64, for example, despite being revolutionary for its time, it also had muddled colors and visual noise all over the place to give the impression of a coherent atmosphere for limitations. Crash Bandicoot was proof on how you can do this more manageably, but Bubsy 3D looks like a toddler's first developed 3D game in comparison. Nothing gives you any idea of your environment, only pasting colors and blocks all over the place and calling it a day. I mean, what's this place supposed to be? A forest? A mountain? A river? Aside from the water, it only looks like a corrupted Jaguar game. It's nonsensical eye ache that permeates the entire game. Sometimes when I'm playing this, I feel like I'm gonna get a headache. Too much of one color can be a bad thing. But the other contributor to that level of agony is the sound design. The music's far from forgettable, sure, but like the graphics, it's nothing but audible noise that sounds like something out of a choir of buttholes. I would make a joke about Bubsy's grating voice, and yes, it is beyond how bad grating can even get.
Oh look! An arrow! Aren't these game designers wonderful?
Nah, the arrows are only a sign of how poorly designed your levels are. I often do say graphics don't always matter as long as your game plays well enough, except that isn't the case with Bubsy 3D. Tank controls are all you have to deal with, whether on dry land or even underwater. Tank controls in of itself isn't always a bad thing, as long as the game itself is built around this control scheme, except this game always has you reacting to things quickly and moving around at a moment's notice, which often means you'll get hit from enemies more times than you'd like to allow, and making wrong moves when you barely have time to react. Doesn't help the camera's really disorienting and doesn't help judge platform distance. It's always behind you or getting stuck on terrain, and the only time it moves is when you jump, which is supposed to help you determine where you'll land, but with it constantly moving up and down on the fly, there goes reason number 2 for my head pains being frequent. Sometimes the game just completely ignores its own rules, like during the first boss fight. Did you know you're supposed to glide over the boss's gun impacts? No? Well, the game never tells you these things. And the level of jank this game has is all over the place. What hurt me there? Actually, that is one thing I'll give this game credit for. It loves to torture Bubsy a lot, even when you finish levels. Hooray! He's dead! On the inside, Bubsy 3D is the pinnacle example of how not to make a 3D platformer, especially for its time. When Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot are your steep competition, you'll never stand a chance in the first place. But on the bright side, at least it's not the worst 3D platformer for the PS1. It's a game that's fairly unknown by a lot of people. Those who do know have horror stories of its existence. It's a game so bad that it makes you wonder why you even became a gamer in the first place. It's a game so bad it could cause physical pain to your hands and fingers. It's a game so bad that, after I first played it, I felt a sudden instinct to murder something. But its rules don't apply to this video, so let's move on. Super Mario 64 is likely what most people think of when referring to 3D transitions, as it was the first true 3D platformer to be released. And I have to say, for being the first of its kind, Mario 64 still does a surprisingly solid job at introducing new players to not just the 3D environment, but the game itself. Nowadays I usually run towards the castle after starting, but the castle grounds acts as a very calm and soothing way of getting yourself acquainted with Mario's moveset and the various tricks you can pull off. My first time playing Mario 64 proper was on the Wii's Virtual Console, so this was after I had played Mario's future adventures like Sunshine and Galaxy. Because of that, I was under the impression that because Mario 64 was considered a revolutionary game for many people, I would love it just as much. And I don't. Don't let that give you an impression that I think Mario 64 is a bad game, because it certainly isn't. I just moved on to this from Bubsy 3D. I think I can expect a good game for once. It introduced many staples the Mario franchise would continue to flesh out, like Mario's moveset. He has the ground pound from Yoshi's Island, he can long jump, triple jump, side jump, do a breakdance? Sucks they never brought this back. This was when Mario games became more than just straightforward point A to point B level designs, and introduced fairly big traversable levels that have many surprises. Your goal in Mario 64 is to collect power stars. There's usually a range of things to do to get them, whether it's as simple as getting to a certain spot in that world, or doing something more specific like collecting coins or sending enemies to hell. But what I like about Mario 64 is that you don't need to collect power stars in the intended order. Most of them only appear when you select their missions in question, but every so often you break away from your task and find another one to complete sooner than you want. I could find the treasure chest in this level, but I could also use the metal cap and get this star that appears sooner than that. Not all the missions are unique though. Do you want to defeat a giant Boo? Do you want to beat it a second time? Do you want to beat it a third time? Do you want to beat... Mario's N64 adventure already set a lot of standards that future 3D platformers would take and expand on, and one of those parts is better control. While Mario 64's controls certainly aren't bad, they aren't my cup of tea either. To be fair, the levels are designed around these limitations, and this kind of solidifies why I'm not a fan of Mario 64 ROM hacks, since they kind of push the controls far beyond the degree they're allowed to handle. Wall jumping is awkward since Mario doesn't slide down like in future games, which means you have to react almost instantaneously when you do so. Mario's acceleration can also become frustrating in smaller areas when you're expected to make timid movements. The controls are functional at best, but are far from perfect. I'm also not a fan of the coin missions, whether it's the red coins or getting 100 coins. It's moments like these where you need to do them perfectly, or else you have to start the progress all over again. Doesn't help that the 100 coin stars always spawn right above you, and if you're in a dangerous spot that's almost impossible to backtrack towards, you're basically screwed. I also wish the game didn't constantly kick you out of the level every time you grabbed a star. Was this a method to hide the game's rather short length? Because even taking that aside, Mario 64 could take an average Joe about 3 to 4 hours to finish if they're going for everything. The game looks fine for the most part, but colors can become rather disorienting or random at times, and some character models look like something out of a bootleg. Bowser in particular looks like his face was swollen by a zinger. When people tell you a game is revolutionary, it's most likely one that was only revolutionary for its time period, and I'm not a firm believer of revolutionary equals good. Mario 64 set the standard that many 3D platformers would follow, which is a remarkable achievement for a game that's nearly 30 years old. It's not my favorite 3D Mario game, but it most certainly is a good one. Even though the DS version is better. Wait, who said that? I mean, give Mario credit, he had better transitions than his rivals. 2. Rivals, actually. There's an argument to be made about what started Sonic's 3D career. Some say it was Sonic 3D Blast for being the first game to have 3D graphics, but it's more of an isometric 3D game, not exactly a proper one. I'd even say Sonic Jam was a better prototype. It had a small Sonic World feature that allowed you to run around and complete basic missions. Nothing remarkable, but again, closer to what a 3D Sonic game could be. There was also Sonic Extreme, but well, its fate wasn't too bright. Nah, Sonic's true proper jump into the third dimension was Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast, the best Sega console. Here I'm playing the actual Dreamcast version, since nowadays I'd prefer to play games as they were originally intended. No 6th generation emulation here, I prefer the numbers below that. Sonic has all the same moves he inherited from the Mega Drive days. He can run fast, do spin dashes, and kill enemies by jumping. I love how the jump feels more floaty here. And despite Sonic's levels feeling mostly linear, it offers a few secrets you can discover for extra lives and power-ups. But this generation of Sonic has seen a few small changes, the most significant being Sonic's homing attack, the first game to utilize it. It was kind of in 3D Blast too, but only as a power-up. As the name suggests, Sonic can home in on enemies and kill them in mid-air. I love this move. It keeps the pace going and makes for some really fun homing trains to get across tricky platforming sections. The only caveat to Sonic's moveset, in my opinion, is his responsiveness. And yeah, no duh, if I want a character to move, I tilt the analog stick. I expect them to do so. It's just that Sonic kind of fidgets around too quickly, which can kind of lead me to suddenly running into a wall when I just meant to turn only slightly. But it isn't just Sonic on his titular adventure, his friends are in on the 3D action as well. Tails' levels see you racing Sonic to the end of the stage, with the obvious benefit being that Tails can f***ing fly. How do you beat it? Hold the A button and maneuver Tails to the end. You beat the level. Woohoo. It's not a bad playstyle necessarily, it controls well and it can be really fun to fly really fast with Tails, but it's just not as fleshed out as what Sonic's story had to offer. Knuckles is a little bit better. His levels are all about finding 3 pieces of the Master Emerald, so they're more about exploration than platforming or speed, except Knuckles has a radar that'll start beeping when you get closer to any of the 3 pieces, so again, most of Knuckles' stages don't require a lot of effort to complete. Still fun levels, better than what Tails had to offer, but not as good as Sonic's. Actually saying that is kind of redundant since they're all worse than Sonic's. But hey, at least Tails and Knuckles were still fun, because Amy is an absolute joke. She runs painfully slow, has a pathetic jump, and the only way she can get any height with distance is with her hammer, which you have to build up by running. All the while, you've got an annoying green robot chasing you that you can't kill. Amy, I know you're far better than this, but I guess Adventure was flat out unfair to you. Then there's E102 Gamma, where your goal is to shoot as many targets in your level as possible, since you have a time limit to keep up. At least he's faster than Amy and feels more fleshed out, even if his boss fights are nothing more than just quick presses of the shoot button. As for Big the Cat, best character. Technically speaking, Sonic Adventure looks pretty nice, the models are nice transitions and the environments look cool, but I'm never crazy about the game's performance. Maybe it's just me, but I hate whenever Sonic games run in 30 FPS or lower. I can tolerate 30 FPS no problem, but with games that are as fast on reflexes like Sonic, it's not ideal for me. That's why I prefer the GameCube version. Yeah, I know, that comment alone is enough to reset my subscriber count to 0, but I mean it. The GameCube version is always my preferred version of Sonic Adventure. The frame rate is better, the loading times are quicker, there's Game Gear games to unlock, a mission mode, an option to skip the cutscenes. This version's better by default. Not having an option to skip your cutscenes should be illegal. So good job, Adventure Dreamcast, you're going to jail for your lousy excuses. Okay, to cut the Dreamcast version some slack, I think some of its lighting is better than the GameCube version. No matter what version you choose to play, Sonic Adventure is a modest game. Sonic's story I feel like is where you're going to get the most enjoyment out of it. Tails and Knuckles are pretty good too, but the other 3 aren't worth any more discussion. The music is also a flat out masterpiece, this having one of my favourite soundtracks of any Sonic game, and even though it's not always polished, as long as you do what the game expects you to do, Sonic Adventure is a pretty good time. The only reason people call the game busted is because they intentionally try to mess it up. So don't do that. Though I wonder if that comment applied to Rare when they were making Donkey Kong 64. Oh boy. Okay, so up to this point, I'd barely played Donkey Kong 64. The most I've seen of it are memes, most of which are actually flippin' hilarious, but as far as the game itself, I had no idea what to make of it. I've never seen a game get such critical acclaim when it came out, only for its reputation to completely backpedal in today's climate. People hate this game now, so much so that they even consider it to be the cause of the death of of the 3D collectathon platformer itself. Despite it receiving a resurgence with games like A Hat in Time, I have to wonder, is Donkey Kong 64 actually that bad? That doesn't mean Donkey Kong 64 doesn't have good things going for it, and honestly calling this game a killer of the 3D collectathon is a bit overdramatic. The problem is that the bad stuff in this game quickly piles on top of each other until you're met with a slow, tedious collectathon that feels more like doing a checklist than playing a video game. I honestly would have been happier if Donkey Kong 64 were more of a straightforward platformer akin to Crash Bandicoot, which was already similar to playing the Donkey Kong Country games in 3D. In fact, it borrows a lot from Banjo-Kazooie, even the music sounds almost identical. If you didn't tell me this music was from Donkey Kong 64, I would have assumed it was from a Banjo game. It's still good music, just not the kind I think fits Donkey Kong that well, given how atmospheric his country tunes were. The visual language of the game is good, definitely still maintaining a bit of that Rareware charm that Banjo had before. The game is technically sound, well, minus the poor frame rate on original hardware, but that stuff I can live with. What I can't forgive is how the game decides to structure its own design. So I've seen a lot of people complaining that Donkey Kong 64 has too many collectibles. In fact, I think it even made it into the Guinness World Records for the most collectibles in a platformer. But I don't think the issue with the game is the amount of collectibles it has, rather how you have to get them. Donkey Kong 64 has 5 playable characters, yes, 5, each with their own unique movesets to help them stand out from one another. I don't mind playing as each of these Kongs, but okay, so Donkey Kong 64 has a variety of collectibles, including the golden bananas, smaller colored bananas, banana coins, blueprints, banana balloons, except the thing is, every single collectible in this game is designated to a specific Kong. The other thing that makes this a chore than necessary is that the only way you can swap between Kongs is with the tag barrel, even though they could have easily used the D-pad to swap between Kongs, which of course goes unutilized in the final game. Yes, Donkey Kong 64 is riddled with backtracking. It's basically backtracking, the video game. I genuinely despise backtracking in games, especially 3D platformers and or collectathons. Sometimes it's not usually that bad, the Spyro games in particular come to mind, but not here. The entire game will have you going back and forth over and over and over again, switching between Kongs, collecting a few things, going to swap for another Kong, rinse and repeat. You know that tedious feeling you get when you play a game 5 times in a row to record everything? Yeah, that's Donkey Kong 64 in the meanest way imaginable. The levels are also way too large and are often riddled with warp pads just to help you finish them slightly quicker. Sorry guys, but the second you put warp pads in your collectathon, show you were being a little bit too ambitious with it. I mean, Banjo-Kazooie's levels were much smaller and had various ways to move faster. And no, this doesn't change if you're playing the game casually. Whether you're going for 100% or not, you'll face this problem face first, 24/7 until you finish it. I came here to have fun with the game, not to do chores. It should also be worth pointing out that a good chunk of the golden bananas you need to get are locked behind minigames, but most of them just aren't that fun. I could say the words beaver bother, and that completely justifies how bad the game is. Some are better than others. I really like the sneaking games, but most of them I ended up skipping just to break from the tedium. Also, why do some of these minigames require you to collect these stupid DK coins? Shouldn't winning that minigame be enough? Why add a pointless collectible on top of that, just to add more to the tedium? I'm trying to get away from it, damn it! Oh, and you want to know the point I couldn't take it anymore? Playing the original Donkey Kong. Actually, let's make this a brief second review because good lord is this game difficult. I get it, it's an 80s arcade game, so that's to be expected, but who's the Einstein that decided you need to play Donkey Kong twice to get a mandatory collectible, while having only one life? At this point, the term video game shouldn't even apply. This is a damn chore. I feel like the ways Donkey Kong 64 could have been fixed are exponential. I think a better option could be, instead of dedicating collectibles to different Kongs, dedicate full-on levels to them. And I mean smaller levels, none of this open-ended rubbish. Therefore, you can ramp up the creativity a little bit and have each Kong feel important without needlessly swapping between them all the time. Or heck, another simple fix would be to just, again, let me swap Kongs with the D-pad. In that regard, if you're going to play Donkey Kong 64, I'd like to point you in the direction of the Tag Anywhere mod, which, you guessed it, allows you to swap between Kongs with the D-pad. I know this isn't exactly the original authentic experience, but screw it, I don't care. This is still my preferred way of playing this game. Just being able able to swap between Kongs on the fly as I'm collecting things results in a more playable and genuinely fun experience. It doesn't fix my other issues with the game, like the tedious slow movement or minigames, but still, a substantial fix to a game like this can drastically improve it. Look, I don't mean to offend anyone who loves this game as much as they do, but I can't stand it. I was having fun with it at first, but the moment I had every single Kong quickly ruined any amount of fun I had while playing it. It's not an awful game, but it's by no means a masterpiece. It's only largely saved by a ROM hack of all things, and if I need a ROM hack to make a game better, something feels wrong. Although I do have a question. Can a ROM hack fix Earthworm Jim 3D? Oh boy, I get to talk about the game where you decapitate cows for a living. Earthworm Jim 3D was the third and final original game in the otherwise solid Earthworm Jim franchise. The first game, while not an amazing time, was still pretty fun with its 90s attitude. I haven't played the second game, nor have I played this game. Until today. The story is that Jim is dead! What? Your goal of the game's 8 levels, yeah, there's only 8 levels, and most of them are barely substantial, have you collecting marbles, because Jim lost his marbles. You can tell this is the case because Jim loves to shout about his brain when doing this. Congratulations guys, you made Dan Castellaneta sound annoying. Anyway, you mix this collectathon aspect in with typical platforming and action like the previous 2 games, yet Earthworm Jim 3D decides to go the insulting approach by taking something that was fast-paced and constantly moving to slow, boring, repetitive collectathon. Oh, I'm starting to get bored just talking about it. And I know for a fact that boring games are always the hardest to talk about. I don't know what it was with so many 3D games at the time having your character move this slowly, but Earthworm Jim should be anything but slow. I'm pretty sure Amy traveled faster than Jim does in this game, and the last thing I should be doing is defending Amy in Sonic Adventure. Even though there's only 8 levels in this game, they feel like they take forever. Not only is your movement incredibly slow, but levels are way bigger than they need to be. I end up using Jim's rolling move over and over again because it felt like I was going slightly faster than Jim's standard run. The levels hardly have anything to do with them. Occasionally you'll fight enemies and do basic tasks, but I swear 80% of this game is just you running through empty rooms to get to your next objective. There was so much to do in the first Earthworm Jim game that it feels like you were doing something new with each level. Here it's just running and shooting stuff. It feels pretty mindless if you ask me. And when you actually do find things to do, that also feels like it takes forever. The first level has you killing enemies in 3 separate rounds just to get 1 pair of underpants. And then the second level has you decapitating cows, the true highlight for all you masochists, and then they just keep coming on every single corner. Combat is also ruined by the horrible camera. It's less helpful than it wants to be because you'll likely be spending more time fighting with the camera than using it. The worst thing about this game though are the boss fights. I know I've neglected talking about bosses for the last 4 games in this video, but I'm gonna make an exception because these boss fights drag the game down even lower than what I thought was even possible. So I'm here on the first boss against this dude with a tank for a willy, and your task is to collect 100 blue marbles to beat him. You do this by riding on a slippery as heck pig, all the while the camera constantly screws you over, and having your opponent shoot missiles at you with perfect accuracy most of the time. Oh sure, you can fire missiles back at him, but they're nowhere near as accurate, and this is still while you're fighting with the controls. Eventually, I managed to beat the first boss and moved on to the second world. Then I get to the second boss and it's the exact same boss as before. It's the same boss. I have to do that all over again. That's right. Every single boss fight is the exact same. Repetition is Earthworm Jim 3D's biggest failure, on top of all the other glaring problems the game is plastered with. And to top it all off, the final boss, aside from also being the same as the last 4, is against Jim's feminine side named Earthworm Kim. Yeah, that sure was the 90s, alright, treating girls as baseless people that carry bags for a living. I'm just about done. Earthworm Jim 3D is a failure in every sense of the imagination, and I can understand now why this ended up being the last game. Though, I personally wouldn't mind them bringing Jim back for a new game. I mean, hell, if Bubsy could get a new game 21 years after Bubsy 3D, I don't see why Earthworm Jim can't get the same thing. So we've had 2 good games and 3 bad games so far. How do we balance it out? Of course, another bad game. Nah, I'm just kidding. Rayman 2 is a great game. In fact, this game was my first introduction to the limbless dude. I played the PS2 version when I was a kid and loved the heck out of it, but funnily enough, I never played any of the others aside from the first one, since it was like, you know, the only playable game on the PlayStation Classic. But Rayman 2 has been ported to so many consoles in its life. First it was a Nintendo 64 game, then it was ported to PC, then Dreamcast, PS1, PS2, DS, 3DS, iOS. You released it on iOS but not the GameCube. The version I'm playing here is the Dreamcast version, because I've heard from many that this is the best way to play the game. You know, after playing Donkey Kong 64 and Earthworm Jim 3D, going to a 3D platformer that feels more traditional like a Mario or Crash game was a breath of fresh air. And it helps that Rayman 2 still looks and plays incredibly well all these years later. You go through linear levels collecting yellow lums, freeing trapped creatures, fighting robots, and making it to the end. Every once in a while you'll fight a boss fight to keep you on your toes, and levels will sometimes introduce smaller obstacle courses to get through. Rayman 2 is the kind of game that has a lot of variety to it like Sonic Adventure, but not in a way that changes the core gameplay altogether. Instead of something boring like fishing or flying in the air or some other crap like that, you're climbing vines, jumping over barrels, flying over wind currents, swinging across pits, stuff that keep with the core of the game itself, and I love that. This game has phenomenal pacing. Rayman controls beautifully, and not once did I come across an uncooperative camera or messy control gimmick. All the while a very mesmerizing score plays in each level, giving you a sort of comfortable journey despite the darker tone all throughout. The only parts of the game I wasn't as favorable towards are the combat encounters. Not because they're bad, but because they often halt your pacing a bit and only require you to strafe around robots and shooting projectiles at them until they die. Despite that, I really enjoyed what I played so far. I was pretty short with my thoughts on it, but for a game as perfectly consistent as Rayman 2, there's not much else to talk about. Who knows, if I do some kind of Rayman retrospective in the future, I'd love to come back to this one. Best game of the whole video, dare I say. Frogger though? I hope today's opposite day. This is Frogger the Great Quest for the PS2. Talk about false advertising. So, this game was conceived by Konami because they felt like the arcade formula of Frogger wasn't going to hold up at the time. Therefore, they turned Frogger into a 3D platformer like Rayman 2, but considering the games that came after this turned back to that formula, yeah, I don't exactly have high hopes for this one. The story is that Frogger is bored with life. He overhears two random kids talk about the princess and the frog tale and decides, yeah, I want that myself. So he makes a wish to go on a grand quest to find a princess that will kiss him and turn him into a prince. Yeah, that's the plot. Frogger decides to be an entitled little shit and goes on a quest to get whatever the hell he wants. That would be like if Mario only saved Peach just to get her cake, if you know what I mean. So yeah, great job giving me an incentive to finish this game, Konami. You actually think I'd feel satisfied seeing this selfish little brat get what he wants? The only ending this should get is Frogger not turning into a prince. His voice is also grating on the ears.
Find a princess before I bust!
I don't like where this is going.
So the game begins, and it's kind of funny how I talked about Rayman 2 before, because this game literally is Rayman 2. Frogger has all the same moves, the environments look pretty similar, and I guess the coins are kind of like the yellow lums. The only difference, of course, is that the game was worse. The controls are terrible, they're way too floaty, which makes it hard to land on basic platforms. Frogger overshoots all his jumps, but then falls at a snail's pace. The one thing you should get right in a platformer is, you know, making the platforming actually functional, and Frogger, the mid-quest, completely spits in the fact of that idea. Oh sure, you have a glide ability to make it easier to land, but I would have used it more if it didn't look so creepy. Did you know frogs mainly croak their throats like that as a mating ritual? So imagine this freakish humanoid frog coming from the sky like that. Just thought I'd leave that haunting image in your brain. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you... pay attention now. The Combat and Frogger the Great Quest for the PS2. And that was the combat in Frogger the Great Quest for the PS2. It also tries to mimic Rayman 2, but screws it up for two main reasons. Firstly, you can only strafe left and right, not in any direction as before. And secondly, enemies don't shoot projectiles at you like the robots in Rayman 2. They come straight towards you, so your rotation of movement only gets smaller and smaller. You can also attack them up close, but, well, as you saw before, it's a bit of a mess. Actually, it's a huge mess. Well, I took some damage from that last combat encounter, so let's grab some health by eating a bug and... I told you there was something I didn't like about him. Every level is just find the one collectible and complete a basic mission, then you finish it. Doesn't matter if it's linear or open-ended, every level is like this. And this wouldn't be so bad if these levels actually had things to do, but they are just so empty. NPCs are barely inhabiting these places and enemies rarely turn up unless they need to. Yeah, there's coins to collect, but they don't do anything for you. They're not for extra lives or completion bonuses, it's just to buy concept art in the shop. That's not worth it when you also keep hearing this sound over and over again. The coins are only there to add unnecessary fluff to empty spaces. Crash Bandicoot, this ain't. The graphics are also horrendous. Not only is there too much green for my liking, but the character models look like something out of a mockbuster film, not a 6th generation video game. Frogger barely looks like a frog, probably because he doesn't actually act like one, and the fairies make me want to blow my eyes out. On top of all that though, Frogger the Bleak Quest does nothing to remind you it's a Frogger game. There's no tile hopping, no gameplay variety to make use of your froggy abilities. Like I said, it's just a poor man's Rayman 2. That'd be like if they took a maze game like Pac-Man and turned it into a basic 3D platformer. That sucks. I have never wanted to stop playing a game as quickly as this. If Bubsy 3D didn't exist, this would easily be the worst game I've looked at in this video. I guess you'd say there'd be some kind of ironic enjoyment for how broken it can get, but not for me. This was a slog. Sonic 06 had more value than this crap. And to be honest, stopping here is probably for the best, so I don't have to see this ugly little crap get his first kiss.
I think you enjoyed that.
No, I didn't, Gex. Shut up. Gex. A character that's such a time capsule of the 90s that it's either really charming or really obnoxious. For most, it was probably the latter. Gex Enter the Gecko, if I can describe it, is probably the safest transition to 3D I can think of, which isn't a bad thing. You control Gex through various TV channels based on actual shows around the time. There's a cartoon world, horror world, future world, kung fu world, prehistoric world, and space world. The level themes are often reused 2 or 3 times, so unfortunately the level variety in this game won't satisfy those looking for more. At least they fixed that issue for the 3rd game. Gex has all the same moves as his 2D counterpart. He can bounce on his tail to get some extra height by pressing the X button again in midair. It's a great move to both get to higher platforms or just barely bounce off ones that are moving really fast. Gex can also climb up walls, but unlike the original, can only climb walls that are marked as such. If not, he gets brain damage. You only have 4 hit points in the entire game, but you can restore them by eating bugs. Oh god, not again. Oh, thank god he just used his tongue. I almost got PTSD from that last game. The game also introduces Gex's karate kick move, which is kind of like Mario's long jump, but you need to be careful when using it since you can't move while doing it. Gex 2 takes a lot from Mario 64, actually. Each level has 3 red remotes and 2 secret white remotes to collect, which usually involve finding secret areas or completing basic missions. There's also bonus levels, power-ups to help you get further, and a lot, and I do mean a lot, of verbal quips from Gex. That's pretty much all there is to Gex 2. It doesn't bring much interesting to the table that I haven't mentioned in the other games. Still, it's a solid 3D platformer that could have been way worse. I'd recommend checking them out on the PSN store for PS3, but the method of doing so can be rather complicated, so hopefully they re-release it for PS Plus Premium. Might as well give that lackluster tier something good for once. Alright, I think we have time for just one more game. Better be a beefy one because I don't want to end this video with a short review. Oh, it's Worms. Because what's better than an Earthworm getting a 3D game? Homicidal Worms, that's what. Worms is pretty simple. You control a team of 4 worms, each with their own names, accents, and actual tombstones, and you murder the heck out of the other teams. It works pretty well in 2D, but what about their first 3D attempt? Well, it's like someone took an FPS game and converted it into a Worms game. Worms 3D is literally just worms in a 3D space, and it's worse. Whilst the 2D games had plenty of landmarks and curves to keep you in the game longer, Worms 3D is riddled with small islands surrounded by water, and usually that means if you get hit, you're gonna drown. At least 90% of my deaths in this game were from unfair placements near water. And then actually trying to use weapons is more difficult than it needs to be because there's no aiming reticle to let you know if a missile will connect. So it's more or less a game of hope your projectiles will hit an enemy, rinse and repeat. If you ask me, Worms was one of those franchises that should have never been done in 3D unless they rebranded it as a proper FPS game. Kind of like when Plants vs Zombies made the jump to 3D. Because this is too clunky, too slow, and too frustrating to get any enjoyment out of. Well, thanks for wasting my time on a basic game, TV. Remind me not to let you auto change to a game I haven't talked about yet. Because next time I'm making decisions for myself. Anyway, now that we're out of time for today, to answer the question of whether or not 2D to 3D game transitions were any good or not, It's usually not the case. Don't misunderstand me. The good games in this video were pretty damn good, and I'd happily recommend them to anyone who hasn't tried them out yet. But in some cases, these franchises have also pumped out better, more refined 3D games that are more worth playing than their predecessors. And of course, most of the games don't hold up well at all. Donkey Kong 64 might have been a masterpiece for its time, but it's such a joke in today's climate. And no way in hell would I ever tell anyone to play games like Frogger the Bland Quest or Bubsy 3D for any enjoyment, whether unironically or not. These are definitely not all the first 2D to 3D games out there. I'm sure there's many I've not even tried yet that maybe I'll do a second part for this subject. But for now, I need a rest, and hopefully I can get some sleep before these Yoshis storm my house while I don't have a plan to calm them down.